Good day, everybody. Our presentation today is a little bit different than other webinars we've been focusing on. And traditionally, as you know, I kind of focus on GASB and so on. GASB is going to be here a little bit, but today we're focusing on what are a government's risks. And joining me today are two members of our Eide Bailly team who know lots about risks and uncertainties. Senior Manager Janeen Hathcock recently completed her 2-year fellowship with the GASB. And one of her roles and responsibilities was to start developing the project that is about to become an exposure draft from the GASB on risks and uncertainties disclosures. It's note disclosure. And it's going to be kind of an interesting project as we go forward. It's not without controversy, that's for sure. Also joining me is my partner, James Ramsey from our Sacramento office. James is going to discuss some changes in auditing risks and uncertainties and estimates that you may want to prepare for. And just to give you a sense, here's our pictures, and because we're going to shut off our cameras just to save on bandwidth, but this is obviously who we look like. So I'm going to shut off my camera, save a little bit on bandwidth, and there we go. So that said, let's get going. Our agenda today focuses on the risks that your government may be exposed to. Now, we can't tell you every single risk that you may be exposed to because every government's differently. But think about what you do daily. Nearly everything you do has some form of risk and uncertainty. We certainly have learned that since early 2020 regarding COVID. Governments have tons of operational risk in addition to the risks and uncertainties we have inherent in the basic financial statements, many of which we are already required to disclose. Also, you're going to be among the first to hear that the GASB is going to propose to change some of those disclosures in the future. And you're going to hear that again from Janeen, who helped work on some of those disclosures. Finally, again, for the auditors in the webinar and for the governments to gear up for, we got to think a little bit differently about risks and uncertainties, procedures in the future. And so we really need to get the party started. We have a limited time today, but hopefully we'll have some time for your questions in the end. So I think about risk a lot. And here, I did this too many times. That's a risk right there. I think about risk a lot. A lot of us think about risk, but we may think differently about it. Just last week, I rode on planes for the first time in over 2.5 years. And gosh, that was a lot of risk. And after all, was anyone within 10 feet of me or on the whole plane as a whole vaccinated? Was the plane going to be reasonably on time so I would not miss my meetings? What about the weather? Yeah, some of us on the call may have a fear of flying. And I bet you there was more than one person on every flight I was on, and I was on 4 flights last week, that probably had a fear of flying. And you may not realize, that many things you do every day, from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep, have some form of risk. And those risks also impact governments in some way, shape, or form. I mean, heck, I was in the security line in National Airport a week ago, this past Friday, and standing not 5 feet behind me was the Speaker of the House. And, just standing there waiting to go through security until somebody noticed her. And then sure enough, in about 45 seconds, 3 folks with M16 showed up to escort her out of the normal security line and whisk her into a different office. And, she went ahead of everybody else after she was screened, along with a bunch of other folks going behind her, all wearing little things coming out of their ears. Now that's risk, being in a public place like that in Washington, D.C. And you think about that, each day. And a lot of those risks that we deal with on a day in and day out basis, again, impact governments. So some of us think about, let's see, there we go. Some of us think about risk with the view on the left picture, while others are on the right. And now, if you're looking at this on a phone, well, maybe I can't help you on that. But for those of us on the left, let's think about it a little bit. Now, is the rope strong enough to carry the gentleman? What is his right leg braced on? Or is he actually kicking something in? Will that slip? Now, what's the deal with his tie? Is that holding him up? Is that not? Will it get caught? Is there something ticking in the case? Will the rope burn? Will it start to rain like it is here in New England right now where I'm sitting? Or worse, lightning and the rope is a metal rope? Will the building facade fall due to his weight? Now, there's also other uncertainty. Is he going up or going down? Is he a thief or a hero? Is that picture real or is it a meme? I know I have to throw that in. It's probably a meme. But there are also other unseen risks here. Again, is that rope tied to anything? Where is his right foot braced? Is someone holding the rope or is he falling? Others think of us with risk regarding risk on the right. Some of us think risk is a game of chance, strategy, and skill. After all, we have dice. Of course, the dice could be weighted. We also don't know what's in the drinks. We also don't know how many hours they've been playing Risk. For those of us who played Risk or still play Risk, it takes hours to play that game. In many ways, risks and uncertainties are somewhere in the middle. No, we are not James Bond, and that's not James Bond, up by the way on the left, because, hey, if I had to use James Bond, I'd probably have to pay a royalty on that. After all, his picture is copywritten. So we're not James Bond, even though technically James Bond is or was a government employee with the British Secret Service. He was paid by the taxpayer. The basic question of risk is, what can go wrong? For some of us, we call that the known unknown, a phrase popularized by former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He always talked about the known unknown. For governments, we know there are risks and uncertainties. The question then becomes, how do we react to them and how do we manage them? And guess what? That leads us into, thinking about risks in a different way. So I'm the national treasurer-elect of the Association of Government Accountants, or AGA, and many of you may be members of AGA, and I thank you for being part of that great organization, and some of you may even be CGFMs. But I was at their National Leadership Training Conference in late February in Washington, and that was my first in-person meeting in a really long time. And of course, you look around and you say, gee, okay, is everybody okay here? At that time, people still wore masks 100% of the time, and that was really cool. But you think about that. So one of the highlights of the conference, getting to risk, was, during the conference, there was a release of a survey of federal agency managers all about risk. And the company Guidehouse performed a survey addressing what are the managers' views on current risks, meaning this month or this year, the perception of risks that will have the greatest impact on the manager's agency, and the perception of risks that will have the greatest impact over the next 3 to 5 years. Now, you may be focused on timely financial reporting, the American Rescue Plan Act funds, or having so many positions to fill due to the Great Resignation. Federal agencies are no different than you are. They're just on a different scale. The Guidehouse survey had perhaps an unsurprising result. The number one risk currently is cybersecurity and privacy. That will pervade for the future. After all, just last week, one of the largest milk producers disclosed that they were hacked, likely by the same outfit who hacked the oil pipeline last year. If a milk producer can be hacked, we are all vulnerable. Now, you may say that you might not care as you're lactose intolerant, but if you have a child that is looking for that carton of milk with lunch, there could be an issue over the next few days if it hasn't been already. Now, indeed, the Great Resignation is a big deal, and the federal agencies are no different. And that is that phrase, human capital risk, that shows up as number 3 and number 2. Now, notice operational and programmatic risk. That is the grander side of the American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Act, and the other trillions of dollars in federal grants that have been approved over the last 2 years. Then notice the other risks and the recurring themes: budget, fiscal, strategic risk, financial, and oh yeah, reputational risk. You don't think that a federal agency cares about its reputation, but they really do. Reputation is a big deal. So at this conference I was at last week in Oklahoma, one of the big issues discussed was, should my pension plan divest from Russian assets and why? What if we hold on to those assets? Now, that could be reputational risks. Of course, ESG is also a buzzword in the pension community. That leads to reputational risks. It was also mentioned about the risk that your government presents in its online presence. After all, we live in a mobile world. What do your citizens think about your government? Is your government spending funds wisely? Now, reputation risk, that is really an emerging issue that a lot of governments need to really start thinking about. So let's break it down a little further and some of the risks that you may see daily. So governments have the same risks that other organizations have. Just look at what the AICPA said in the 2020-2021 audit risk alert during, and this was during the heart of the pandemic. The risk alert also separated risks to organizations between operations and financial statement risks, just like we're talking about today. And on my screen right before the webinar, it flashed on the screen that COVID testing and COVID vaccination has really hit a low point. And the question is, what's the risk in that one? And so look at these risks that you have, and you probably are facing the same thing. Again, just like the federal agency manager said, cyber and other technology risk is huge. Every email, every attachment is a potential opening to a hacker. Think about what you've gone through during the pandemic, and now we're paying about $4 a gallon of gas. Don't even think about walking into a car dealer and walking out with a brand new vehicle unless you really are not picky about color or not picky about features or even whether or not it's new or used. Gee, I wonder why companies like Ford are encouraging you to order your new truck. Now, that was unheard of 2 years ago. Gee, go out and order a new truck. Maybe you'll save a lot of money. I was looking at new car prices last night in preparation for this, and I couldn't find one that was less than manufacturer's suggested retail price. In a lot of ways, a lot of cars, they're $2,000 and $3,000 more. That was unheard of 2 years ago. And then think about how long it's taken to produce your financial statements over the last few years. In our case, it's the exact same thing. All organizations are impacted by the Great Resignation. Management may be doing staff level work just to get work accomplished. And some of this is just pure demographics. The boomers are all retiring. And quite frankly, there's a ton of burnout. But then there's a shortage at the other end of the spectrum. Last week, there was an article in my local newspaper about the coming lengthy shortage of college entrants due to the low birth rate after 9/11. And during the Great Recession back in 2008 and 2009, there was a low birth rate. So there's going to be a lengthy period of low college entrance, fewer students going to college. There's just not enough people going around. Last Monday, I was boarding my first plane ride to head to this conference, and not 15 feet away from me was the president of a local public university, very well known in my area. And he was talking to the trustees about how the university was not going out of business due to low enrollment. And everybody in the gate could hear him talking. And you got to think about reputation risk there, but he was pretty loud about it and pretty serious about it. And then many of us are returning to our offices if you're not there already. Some of us are looking more feral than others. We got beards going and we've been wearing sweatshirts for 2 years and so on, and wearing jeans for 2 years or sweatpants. And gee, do we fit into our old office clothes? So there's a little bit of risk right there. Do we fit into our old office clothes? But then think about your office. Do we reopen or not? What does our office look like? Is our coffee mug full of 2-year-old coffee that we just left there? And gee, it's kind of sprouted a coffee plant or mold or something, because we ran out of the office in March 2020 without washing our cups out. We were afraid. Should we wear masks? Does my office pass still work? These and other risks are all operational. And especially with folks who may say, something, I just don't want to return to my office. That's all operational risk. So I mentioned cybersecurity and technology risks as it's really at the forefront of us all. Again, according to the federal agencies and perhaps according to your chief information officer or chief technology officer, they're probably thinking a lot about cyber and technology risks as it's really in the forefront of us all. Again, it's that number one risk that a lot of people are thinking about. So let's get through some of the jargon. Cybersecurity is your ecosystem of protection, your systems, your networks to all points, including the mobile devices. For example, the headset that I'm on, has it been attacked? That's part of the mobile device. The access to your systems, your data, your assets, your operations, is it all protected? Is your people protected from malicious actors who could even be your own employees or someone from overseas or someone wanting to make your life miserable sitting in their basement? You'd be surprised how many attacks happen by insiders. It does happen. That's your cybersecurity ecosystem. Is what does that all look like? The method of operations is a cyber attack, which happens to every system 24/7 by 365, or in leap years, 366. Many cyber attacks, unfortunately, are automated. They're done by bots doing the attacking. Do I have a case of cyber paranoia? You absolutely bet. Attacks are common. And again, I mentioned they happen daily. I mentioned the milk producer, for those of you who buy cartons of milk like I do, that's JP Hood, and they're among the largest milk producers in America. They were hacked a couple of weeks ago. All its plants were shut down due to the hack. That cost them millions of dollars just in lost productivity. Now, we all know SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, JBS. Some had ransomware demanded, of course, payable in crypto. Don't get me started on cryptocurrency. None of these are laughing matters, as many impact you not just from a government perspective, but in some cases, part of your daily lives. After all, you wouldn't want to be in a hospital that just got hacked, because all of their information on their patients, it may be compromised. On the cybersecurity side, the same risks you face are also faced by securities professionals. there are not enough people going around to staff these cyber threat centers. You know, cybersecurity is the fastest growing career in the United States, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. 2 out of 3 cybersecurity roles remain unfilled, and at the end of 2021, there were 3 million. Let me say that again: 3 million unfilled cybersecurity positions just in the United States at the end of 21. Ransomware is very common. It's become more expensive, more persistent, and more sophisticated. You're not seeing the folks who ask for $500 anymore. They're getting really creative on it. And again, oh, by the way, they want to be paid in crypto. So if you don't have access to crypto, guess what? You're not getting your data back. The attacks are getting sophisticated. They're attacking your supply chain. So it's not just the government itself, it is the vendors who deal with you. And so you need to have that threat protection not only at your level, but at all the levels that may interact with you, including all your information that you outsource. You know, there may be malware in the supply chain somewhere, and that's exactly what happened with SolarWinds. There is also targeted ransomware where there may be a further hack that is embedded in the solution to the ransomware. There may be phishing expeditions. They're really on the rise. And if your organization does not do random phishing tests, it's just sitting there, waiting to be poached. I mean, we do random phishing attempts almost every single day. There's also a growing attack surface. Think about your own personal residence. Do you use a Nest thermostat? Do you have a mesh internet system like most residents do have a mesh internet system, especially if you happen to have a large house? Chances are you got to have a mesh internet system. Do you have lights that turn on and off? Do you have a lock that's electronic? Do you have a car that has a remote starter? That is a growing attack service for this thing called Internet of Things. Your smartwatch, which mine just went off, my smartwatch, cell phones, cameras, your washing machine, my washing machine you can look at it, your refrigerator. Those are all a growing attack surface for being hacked. Of course, that's just your residence. Now think about it from a government perspective. How many things are interconnected into your ERP system? And you can almost map out the landscape of a cyber threat. With COVID, more and more people are working remotely. You might not have the best or maybe improper security controls in place. And something, the practices are better than where we were 2+ years ago, but still it's not 100% ideal. Think about it, especially if you're part of a school system. You may have students that are interacting into your system. And guess what? They're on their own systems in their houses. Are those systems vulnerable? So of course there are those sort of threats. And then you have the insider threats. Most organizations are concerned with keeping, the outside threat actors from breaching your network, but they don't focus or monitor those insider threats. Last week, the session that I participated in was talking about this concept of zero trust. And that's something as a firm that we do, that we really, if our laptops are not where they usually are, so if I log in from a hotel like I did last week, or log in from an airplane, try doing that at 36,000 feet, my laptop is not trusted. And that is zero trust. And in some cases, I have to use multi-factor identification, and that is really growing in popularity. You may think it's a hassle to type in an extra PIN code or show your face or things like that, but that concept of zero trust is really important. Your employees have more access than required because it's easier to give your employees all access than it is to really identify what should be the right access. And so that is a risk your government deals with. Now, you got to monitor that access and you got to test those vulnerabilities every single day. Now, what is the impact of an attack? A lot of us know really all too well. There are four common phases of an attack. It's almost like a 7-step process when you're trying to recover from alcoholism. There are four common phases of an attack. For the first is doing some reconnaissance, figuring out what is the nature, breadth, and extent of how much we've been hacked. But that's afterwards. What the hacker is doing well in advance of that is doing some targeted reconnaissance of your system. They're gathering information on you. They're looking at your website. They're looking at LinkedIn. They're looking at your other social media presence. They're gathering little tasty tidbits of information about how you operate. They're looking at vulnerabilities, any sort of motivation. And then they're customizing their hack just for you. Then they exploit some weakness in you. It's almost like the coronavirus. The coronavirus may have been around for a while, but it was doing some reconnaissance on your body and saying, gee, where is Eric vulnerable? And where can I actually go in and target him? Not that I thank God I'm knocking on my PC that I haven't gotten the coronavirus, but still, okay, where is he vulnerable? Does he ride on planes? Does he wear a mask? So on. It's the same thing as a hack. And then how can I exploit that? Now, sometimes, as I mentioned, bots are doing that exploitation. In other cases, it's human beings. And then they do a delivery of that hack. And often they do it via social engineering. Social engineering is as old as your government, meaning try to get that certain person who is way overworked to approve something. And there was a very famous hack that went on maybe about 10 or 12 years ago with one of the big four accounting firms, and they were a vendor of 3 states. And a hacker just changed one letter in their name, and their name it was a little bit hard to pronounce. And by changing that one letter, they were able to steal tens of millions of dollars out of 3 state governments. That is social engineering. By laying low, doing some reconnaissance, and then doing some vulnerability. And sometimes it's a sophisticated compromise, meaning a supply chain attack. They'll attack one of your vendors and then go into your government from there, because they'll go to the weakest point of vulnerability. And guess what? If they don't succeed, they'll always trying again. And they'll keep trying to gain that access or spread out the access into multiple bots to try to hack you. And sometimes they use their own native tools to do it. Their objective is to gather information and then exploit that information and hold that information at bay for ransom and extortion. And that is the methodology of a cyber attack. So keep this in mind when you're attacked, and don't say you haven't been warned. Is there protection out there? Of course, but they all depend on the human element. And again, you may be getting a polling question. Who knows? Maybe that's a hack. I know it's not a hack. It's just a pop-up on your screen. But all of these depend on the human element that are out there. I mean, you may be using a system to scan every email like our firm does. You may be using a system that is that has some endpoint security or some infrastructure security, such as such as Sophos or Fortinet. You may be using some form of specialized threat analysis and protection, such as Endgame or threat intelligence or mobile device security. All of these really are part of your cybersecurity architecture, but all of them depend on some form of human element that's out there. Of course, where there's an attack, there is a breach. You have to have more than a 50, you have to realize there is more than a 50-50 shot of being attacked. We really have to have that mindset that we are all vulnerable. And when you are attacked, it is costly. For small and medium-sized organizations, the average cost is $380,000 per attack. And for for-profits and not-for-profits, not governments, but for for-profits and not-for-profits, once you get attacked, 60% of those small and medium-sized organizations will go out of business within 6 months of being victimized by an attack. As a government, your life is going to be pretty miserable for about 6 months, and it's going to distract you away from your core mission, your core program, just to remediate it. So it's really important. Cybersecurity is important because cybercrime is the fastest growing crime in the United States. There's a lot of talk among political folk about crime and, oh my God, crime. God bless public safety, what they have to deal with on a day in and day out basis. But cybercrime is where the real deal is. The cost per breach, again, amounts to approximately $150 per record. And that's just the cost to, it costs to remediate, to gather the data back. The cost nearly triples when it comes to healthcare related hacks, especially in public hospitals. And I know there are a bunch of public hospitals that are on the webinar today. Your cost is about $450 per record, the criminals tend to lay low in your system. They're just observing you for up to 3 months before unleashing all heck. They want to learn about you before they pounce, and they are there. Don't underestimate. Now, again, there are state privacy laws, especially, for example, in the state of California, and the cost of violating that privacy could be as much as $7,500 per client. But think about that in the next hack of a license database. That's a lot of car licenses that may be hacked. Again, the criminal lays low, but once that breach occurs, it takes a while to recover from them. Most breaches take about 8 months, or as I mentioned in the previous slide, about $360,000 to recover from them. Indeed, most breaches are financially motivated, but others are just there to make your life miserable. Now, the savings of being prepared and plan for a breach is absolutely clear. If you add it up, the average, if you happen to have a plan, it costs you about $3 million, and that's the total personnel cost to work on the plan, the total to exercise the plan, the total to change it on, and to get it going. And then once you get it going, you spend the money. Then it gets a little bit easier. It's just maintaining and changing the plan consistently. Now, compare that to not having a plan and not having a team. That's about 5 million, or about 40% less. And these are national averages. Now, you should have something called an operations continuity plan. Most of us say, okay, let's have a disaster recovery plan. And that's great, especially you folks down south that are dealing with the, tornadoes these days, and in Texas and Louisiana. Yeah, and of course you deal with floods all the time across, the central part of the country. Yeah, you need a disaster recovery plan. But what about in the second phase, the operations continuity plan? If you don't have one, cyber attacks necessitate one. That's for darn sure. You don't want to be left behind when an incident occurs. And guess what? Test that plan every so often. Again, the cost of that breach is 40% less if you have a plan, and it's easy to understand why. The testing of a plan is pretty simple. Let's say you do your backups to a cold, what's called a cold site, meaning, every week you back up your data, somewhere, somehow, and it's usually off-site, out of state, and so on. How often do you restore your data, and how often do you compare it to make sure that, yes, you can continue operation? And if you're not doing that, that is really a problem in the face of a cyber attack. But there are other risks beyond cyber. There are large sums out there to help you fund and modernize and make your systems resilient. The funds mainly went to states, and they do require a state match of increasing percentages over the next few years. But remember that the cost for preparing and modernizing your systems is far less than the cost of remediation. And I'm going to be talking about this next week during our webinar on ARPA and the Infrastructure and Investment Act. So you may want to sign up for that today. I already know we have a few hundred of you already signed up for that one. And it'll be a roundtable on ARPA and the Infrastructure Act. And one of the hallmarks of the Infrastructure Act is building that cybersecurity defense and security, and maybe building up the rest of your infrastructure for remote work. And so thinking about your operations right now, how much of your operations are manually driven? And each one that is manually driven increases your risks and uncertainties. Now, all of us have done things manually, and you may be, continuing manual processes. I had a conversation this morning with one of my clients who's a state, asking me how to, book some entries regarding GASB 68 and GASB 75. And we went through those entries and doing the schedules, but it's largely a manual driven process. Each one of those manual driven process has risk. And so those are really the elements on the left. And, think about it. Okay, so if you're putting together your annual financial report and a lot of it is manually driven, that's going to increase your risk of an untimely financial report. And oh, by the way, if you're doing your journal entries in Excel, guess what? Your risk of material misstatement, that's going to really go up, because we all know how easy it is to change a journal entry in Excel, don't we? You're probably going to have a bunch of those errors that go undetected. Maybe, hopefully you're not creating cash. That's for darn sure. As about 12 years ago, I had one of my managers do a $24 million one-sided entry, and he was really, despondent about the fact that he did it, and it was all sorry and everything. But the issue was really, how did that go undetected, and how did that make it to my desk before his superior, didn't see that happening? And that goes towards inadequate monitoring. Now, I mentioned the Great Resignation. A lot of us are doing the work we're not used to doing. We're doing manual things that maybe our staff used to do. And that's a lack of segregation of duties. Of course, when you have a lack of segregation of duties, haste makes waste, and you're going to take the easy way out. That's being human, is trying to get it off your desk. But that's a manual risk. Guess what? Those automated risks on the right-hand side aren't much better. You always run the risk of some form of misconfiguration. There's more than one government out there that implemented an ERP system with too many customizations. And every time you got a customization, every time you upgrade, you run the risk of having a misconfigured system. You also may say, hey, you may have too much reliance on that system. And so there's a lack of oversight on that system. Of course, if you outsource all of your upgrading and so on to a third party, how do you know that you're getting the proper information and the proper code in that ERP system? And of course, there are internal as well as external stakeholders that really add risk to your systems. And then, of course, cybersecurity. So again, there's other stuff that's going on for governments. There's inflation, supply chain risks. Again, you're not immune from all this stuff. Much of your budgetary activity is the procure to pay cycle. You do an RFP, you choose a contractor, you sign a contract. The contract provides services and the contractor gets paid. That's the classic, old, procure to pay cycle. Okay, you do an RFP for an auditor. You choose Eide Bailly. You sign a contract with Eide Bailly. Eide Bailly audits you and Eide Bailly gets paid. Now that's under normal times. Now, all of us remember what it took to get PPE 24 months ago. Governments were dealing with a lot of unscrupulous middlemen, and frankly, a lot of money was being wasted. Inflation is going to impact budgets. It's not just gas prices. Yeah, the airports I was in last week, they were packed, but much of that is a function of spring break. A lot of folks heading down to Florida for spring training because, before I started traveling, Major League Baseball signed a new deal and spring training got going on. And a lot of folks also, ended up going down to Arizona. There was also St. Patrick's Day going on and everybody being cooped up for 2 years and saying, happy days, no more COVID. But at some point, people are going to get tired of paying a ton for plane tickets. And, for an Uber ride last week in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, I paid over $40 to go 10 miles from the airport into the city center. And the last time I was in Oklahoma City before COVID, that was maybe at best half that price. That there's going to be a leveling off at some point. And, at some point, people are going to get tired of paying $50 for an Uber ride from the airport. And that leveling off is going to have a domino impact on some smaller governments. Governments have also been lowering taxes lately, adding to that domino effect. Lower the tax revenue, the lower the intergovernmental aid, the higher the risk and uncertainty. But at the same time, there's wage inflation, which not only has a current impact, but for your defined benefit plans, it has a long-term impact. After all, if a retiree is based on the average of the 3 highest years, guess what? Benefit payments go up, increasing your net pension liability. Now, let's not even go down the rabbit hole of healthcare costs. You know how much healthcare costs are. But budgets are going to have to rise, and it's not just salaries, it's commodities, benefits, and service costs. All of this is budgetary risk. When I left public service in 2010 to go to be an audit partner, my state budget was $27 billion. I looked the other day, it was over 50 and in Massachusetts. That's not just inflation. That is just an overall rise in what we do on a day in and day out basis. Not to be all doom and gloom, but there's, in the immortal words of Steve Jobs, there's more. There are 7 major trends in human capital, especially in the public sector. During a January meeting, the Maryland Senate president said, we've got to make salaries more competitive across the board. And the lead economist from Moody's Analytics, Dan White, who some of you may have heard speak before, he's fantastic. He said at the same meeting, the state and local government rate is as high as it has ever been. And we have more state and local job openings than we have in any other industry. And I don't need to tell you that there's more state and local job openings than you've ever seen. While the private sector can raise prices to offset rising wages, state and local governments, it's a lot harder. You're having to compete in a very difficult labor market now. And attracting folks into the public sector labor force is going to be incredibly difficult over the next 4 to 5 years. That's according to Moody's Analytics, Dan White. At this conference I was at last week, the first session was on this exact same issue. What are the trends that governments may have to embrace? Just like other organizations, you may have to embrace access to flexible work schedules. Whether existing employees get compensation as new employees are demanding higher starting wages, whether there should be a shorter work week. After all, even some federal agencies offer 80 hours over 9 days. That's not a bad idea. That's an awesome idea as it cuts down sick leave. Study after study have said that 80 hours over 9 days with 3-day weekends built in, that cuts down sick time. Hybrid and remote work will be increasing, especially for knowledge-based workers. If your government can't be remote, HR executive predicts you'll have a higher turnover. So you need to build that into your budget. Remote tools are going to be essential, especially for new hires. And if you don't have Teams or Zoom like we're on right now, your job candidates are moving on, and your current employees are not going to be happy. By the way, those tools are now being customized for job performance measures. As our parents used to say, showing up is half the battle. So you got to have those tools just to manage your day-to-day life. And then we've all been focused on wellness over the last 2 years plus. Well, now guess what? Wellness benefits are probably going to be a permanent benefit. Get used to the workouts during lunch breaks or wellness breaks at odd times during the day. 94% of organizations are investing in them per Gartner Group. Why? Why are they investing in wellness benefits? Because each dollar lowers healthcare costs, especially sick leave. As it says here, sitting is the new smoking, and I'm actually standing right now. We may all have to embrace standing. My watch tells me, and that's one reason why it was dinging, it says stand up. My watch tells me when I need to stand up, and yours should too. We've all learned during the pandemic, the more we sit, the more we look like Jabba the Hutt. And that is not good for our bodies. The more we look like Jabba, the more our healthcare costs go up for our government, the more budgetary drag for our governments. Finally, we got to take DEI seriously. Unfortunately, HR professionals believe that the more we shelter at home, the more isolated we become, and the less we embrace others. That'll be a tug of war between the warriors who go into the office and those who need to work from home for whatever reason, be it a sick parent, lack of childcare, or some other reason. All of this breeds a decrease in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, these are HR risk trends which will impact your government. And they did not, HR executive said this impacts every organization. So let's head down the road of your financial statement risk, because I know how much you love GAAP. So you may not realize that nearly every one of the numbers in your financial statements is an estimate. How many of you have actual currency on hand at the end of your fiscal year? Do you know the carrying value of your capital assets? I bet you don't. I'm sure all of you have inspected your bridges lately for asset impairment. Do you really know how much the asset retirement obligation is fairly stated on your electric plan? Is that calculated right? And then there's this thing called compensated absences. Yeah, sure. Of course, the liability for sick and vacation. Sure you do. I'm 100% sure you know the exact liability for that sick and vacation. Yeah, I'm sure you know the current portion of your pension and OPEB to the exact dollar. Every single one of those numbers, and I'm going to go back one slide here, every single one of these numbers, and this is straight out of a set of an annual financial report, every single one of these SNPs is an estimate. Guess what? That is the risk of material misstatement. Now, let's take it a step further. Only a handful of us have read what the auditor's responsibility are in the financial statements. But look at this phrase that I bolded. Notice this, notice the first two words of that sentence. Reasonable assurance. Reasonable assurance. It does not mean absolute assurance that the auditor has detected a material misstatement. Yes, we live in a world of risks and uncertainties. Now take a look at the rest of this. It says, we might as well just read it together. Reasonable assurance is a high level of assurance, but it is not absolute assurance, and therefore it is not a guarantee that an audit conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards will always detect a material misstatement when it exists. The risk of not detecting a material misstatement resulting from fraud is higher than the one resulting from error, as fraud may involve collusion, forgery, intentional omissions, misrepresentations, or the override of internal controls. Now think about it in the context of your financial statements when, after the webinar, you open up your statement in that position, the last one you audited. Do you really know the numbers in there? They're all estimates. Now, this is a good segue to my friend Janeen. So Janeen, and here, I'm going to unmute you here. Let's see if I can unmute you. Let's see. That's a risk right there. And here's a risk right there. Risk in the webinar. That's a great segue. So Janeen, what's the GASB considering in terms of those risks and uncertainties?
All right. Well, thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. And I'm going to say good morning to everyone since we still have 7 minutes in our morning. I appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy days to be with us today. But GASB does have this project on their technical agenda regarding risks and uncertainties disclosures. Eric, can you go back one more slide for me, please? Now, as Eric had mentioned in our introductions, I did just return to Eide Bailly from a 2-year fellowship at the GASB, where I was the project manager over the RUD project. Now, this project was approved by the board to add to GASB's technical agenda in July of 2020. And the original plan was to have a final statement issued by December of 2021 before I left to come back to the firm. Well, let's just say we had a lot of spirited discussions with the board, and we still aren't yet to an exposure draft for this one. Now, my hope over this part of the presentation is to give you all an idea of what the board has in mind for this disclosure. Now, obviously, we do have a ways to go. The ED is expected to be issued mid-summer, and it will most likely include a 90-day comment period. So for those of you who don't know, GASB allows for a specified time after an exposure draft has been issued for their stakeholders to comment on that draft before they issue a final. So this includes users and auditors and preparers all have this opportunity to make comment. So if there is anything that we do go over today that you are very passionate about and you might want to comment on it, please do so. It is a vital part of our the standard setting process. So once that comment period is over, the project team will compile all of the comments and present all substantial comments to the board. And then they think about them and then potentially redeliberate before they issue a final statement. All right, so let's jump into what this project is all about. I'm first going to give you a little bit of background. So the purpose of the project is to identify risks and uncertainties in the government environment and then consider developing related disclosure requirements for those risks. Now, the reason that the board added this to its technical agenda was in response to some stakeholders' requests that the board consider certain disclosures regarding risks and uncertainties that governments face. And this was actually prompted by the ongoing financial and economic issues that were caused by the pandemic. So the board began their deliberations in September of 2020. And as I mentioned before, they do expect to issue an exposure draft this year. Okay, so prior to jumping in feet first into a project, the board will identify certain considerations that they want for the project. Now, these considerations for the RUD project is listed on this slide. So let's go through these together. First, what information is essential to users regarding the disclosures? Okay, so you might be wondering, how does GASB determine what is essential? Well, it's a very good question. GASB has concept statements, which serve as a guide for the board to make their decisions. So let me give you an analogy. So picture a farm with a bunch of cows roaming around in the field. Well, the ranchers will go and put up a fence to guide them to where they can or cannot go, which is what the concept statements do for the board. Yes, concept statement 3 addresses an essentiality requirement for note disclosures. And the board, to make it interesting, the board also has a project on their technical agenda on clarifying the concepts in Cons 3 for note disclosure. So that project is expected to go final this summer. But as a side note, the project was actually supposed to go final last year, but based on the comments that they received during their comment period after the exposure draft was issued, the board had made some changes and they believed they were significant enough that they decided to revise an exposure draft and issue a second comment period. So the board does listen. But this project clarifies what is meant by the term essential. So essential conveys a certain degree of importance that the information contained in notes should possess. Well, the exposure draft on that project provides for 3 characteristics that essential information should have. 1, you've got users that will utilize the information in their analysis and decision making, or those users would modify their decisions if the information became available to them. The second, the information in the notes would have a meaningful effect on the user's analysis for making decisions or assessing accountability. And then finally, a breadth and depth of users would utilize that information in their analysis. So keep those in the back of your mind because I'm going to hit on them again here in just a few slides. But because this is a disclosure project, we did do a test drive, if you will, of the clarified concepts for notes in that project. So our second consideration here is also related to this. The board wants to ensure that the information to be disclosed with this project, it will have a level of specificity, so it doesn't become boilerplate. Now, why? Well, boilerplate information, it's just not useful to users in financial statements, and they have told us as such. So another consideration is what guardrails should this project have to assist the preparers when they're determining whether they need to make the disclosure or not. And then how do we, as the board, emphasize that disclosing risks and uncertainties that governments face should not include predictions or projections in these disclosures, because that information is not suitable for a note disclosure. And then finally, how will this project relate to severe financial stress or going concern? And that is actually a different project on the agenda altogether. But I can tell you now that the board does see this project on the same scale as those other 2, severe financial stress or going concern. So if you had risks on one end of a scale, the further down you go, down the scale, you get to severe financial stress, and then you could get to going concern. Now, the board does view these disclosures as early warning signs of those governments who could eventually make their way down that scale. So the board began using GASB's Topic 275 as their baseline, but it was clear that they needed to look at these risks and uncertainties. In that standard, it's nature of operations, significant estimates, and vulnerabilities due to certain concentrations, but they needed to look through those categories through the lens of a governmental entity. So first things first, our project team interviewed 38 users to gauge the essentiality of these 3 beginning categories. And then we also asked the users to describe any additional categories that they wanted the board to explore. So the users that we interviewed, they ranged from academics to citizens to the municipal bond community. And the board tentatively decided that the project should not be so widespread that the preparers and auditors could not assess the completeness of the information, because as we all know, governments are exposed to a wide variety of risks and uncertainties, as Eric spent some of our morning talking about already. So the scope was limited to certain categories. Now, in addition to these categories, the board tentatively decided that those categories should also include other limitations to further narrow the scope. So the board tentatively decided that these limitations should include components of a degree of likelihood, a degree of impact, and a specified time frame. The board also decided to limit the categories to include risks and uncertainties for current vulnerabilities due to certain concentrations and the government environment. So the category description for concentrations, it was tentatively decided to be a risk to the government that is based on a condition that creates either a lack of diversity related to an aspect of a significant revenue or of flexibility in managing a significant expense. So the category description for our second category on government environment, the board tentatively decided on a risk to the government that is based on a current condition that's common in the government environment, but it's not necessarily limited to governments. And it creates a limitation on acquiring resources or controlling spending. Now, some of you might be thinking that these descriptions could be rather vague, but do remember GASB does set standards for all governments that implement GAP across the country, and the guidance is more conceptual and less prescriptive because of this. So it happens with our governments here in Colorado, it might be different than, let's say, the governments in Connecticut. So the board does understand that these descriptions are vague. So they have tentatively decided to accompany each of those categories with certain examples. Now, the examples are not intended to be all-inclusive, but they're there to assist the preparers with what is meant by the category description. So the overall objective of these disclosures is to provide essential information to users about the risks that governments face, and they may impact their ability to continue to provide services and meet their obligations as they come due. Oops, okay. So yes, it is shaping up to look like governments may have another disclosure, but it's only if you have a risk that will fall within either one of those 2 categories, and your government will have to meet certain criteria of those limitations. Now, as I mentioned before, the goal here is to develop disclosure requirements that will produce information that is essential to the users. So the board decided that they wanted to do a second user outreach, and we interviewed 51 users, and only a few of them were a repeat from our first round. But the board wanted them to weigh in on the essentiality of that information that the board had developed so far. So it was determined that the potential disclosures would result, or the potential disclosures that would result were essential to those users. So remember, there are those three characteristics of essentiality. Okay, so through that second user outreach, we had evidence that one, the information, if the information became known to those users, they would modify their decisions regarding that government. Second, the information that would result from those disclosures would have a meaningful effect on their analysis. And how we obtained that evidence is we asked the users to describe how they would use the information to make those decisions. And then finally, there was a breadth and depth of users that were interviewed that would use the information. Okay, so let's look at this proposal kind of in print. Remember, first you have to have a risk that falls within one of the two categories described previously in concentrations or government environment. Okay, next you would apply the limitations to those risks. They're not in no specific order on this slide, but your risk will have to meet all three of these to be required for disclosure. Now, so first, on our slide, we have the degree of likelihood. So is it at least more likely than not that an event associated with the condition will occur within 12 months of the financial statement or shortly thereafter? And we have a term here, it's more likely than not. This is the only degree of likelihood that is quantified in GASB's literature, and it means greater than 50%. So if your answer is yes, then you're going to move on to your next limitation. If it's no, you don't have a disclosure. Okay, so our next limitation is the degree of impact. Is it at least reasonably possible that the event would have a substantial impact on the government's ability to continue to provide services at the level of the current reporting period or meet its obligations as they come due, right? Well, we've got two new terms here that's going to help drive your answer, right? First, we have reasonably possible, and it is defined in literature as more than remote, but less than likely. Our second term is substantial. Now, that one is not specifically defined in GASB's literature, but it has been interpreted to be greater quantitatively and qualitatively than significant. Now, significant isn't defined in literature either, but it has been interpreted to be synonymous with material. Okay, and so if you have an answer to that as yes or no, it will drive whether you have the disclosure. So if the answer to that is yes, you're going to move on to the third limitation, which is the time frame. Okay, so will the substantial impact occur within 2 to 3 years of the financial statement date? Now, the board used this range because they do understand that it could take some time for governments to feel a substantial impact. We don't always feel them right away. But it was a fine line because they can't go too far out into the future because it could be a projection of some sort. So it is important to note also that the information about the risk is known by management of the government before the financial statements are issued. And it is proposed that these disclosures would be reported at the level of your primary government unless the effect of the risk is substantially different for a reporting unit, then you would report it at the reporting unit level. Okay, so as I had mentioned before, our category descriptions might seem kind of vague. So this slide is a list of examples that the board has decided to include to supplement those category descriptions. So let me first remind you that the category descriptions for concentration was a risk to the government based on a condition that creates either a lack of diversity related to an aspect of a significant revenue or flexibility in managing a significant expense. So some of the examples here of what the board means by this is a concentration of principal employers in your geographic area. So what happens if a large employer moves out of your jurisdiction? What about a concentration of principal resource providers? You know, what happens if your government relies heavily on federal dollars and then the feds cut the program funding? A concentration of principal resource providers. So what happens if a large car dealer moves out of your jurisdiction? And that's a significant source of your sales tax revenues. Okay, and then finally, what about a concentration of labor? So what happens if you have a unionized workforce that goes on strike? Or what happens if you have a labor union that doesn't agree on a bargaining agreement in time? Okay, do any of those pose a risk to your government that will meet all of the limitations? All right, so next, what about our risks in our government environment? So a reminder that this category is described as a risk to the government based on a current condition that's common in the government environment, but not necessarily limited to governments, but it creates a limitation on acquiring resources or controlling your spending. So some examples here include any limitations on raising revenue. Does your government have a property tax cap, which limits your ability to raise revenue to mitigate a certain risk? Any expense limitations? Does your government have any debt covenants that it must abide by, requiring you to keep your expenses lower? Okay, is there any inflexibility in reducing your expenses, like an unfunded mandate that you must follow? And then are any externally imposed limitations on your government to incur debt? So remember, just because you have these risks, they still must meet all three limitations on our previous slide. So going back to the board's considerations for this project, the intent here is to not have boilerplate disclosures that get carried over year after year after year. So the only time it really should get carried over is if your risk continues to meet all of the criteria. Now, since I left, effective January 1, the board has tentatively decided on the disclosure requirements. And then also they have finalized some of our non-authoritative illustrations, giving a certain set of facts and circumstances that will be included with the exposure draft. So to give you an idea, some disclosure requirements do include an indication that it is at least more likely than not that an event associated with the condition will occur. An indication that within a 2 to 3 year time frame of the financial statement date, it is at least reasonably possible that the event will have a substantial effect on that government. Also, any actual mitigation efforts should be required to be disclosed for each of your disclosed risks. Unless your government has mitigated that risk to the point that it no longer meets the disclosure requirement, then you wouldn't have to obviously disclose any actual mitigation. But the board does believe that the descriptions of the risk and the associated event, they are necessary to meet those tentative objectives of the disclosure. So in other words, if the nature of the event is not communicated to the users, then they would have no basis for their understanding of what is at least more likely than not, or even have that relevance of the risk that is faced by that disclosing government. So that's what they have on their agenda. Hopefully we see something this summer. And with that, I will pass it along to James.
Great, thank you so much, Janeen. All right, so here we're going to talk risk assessments. If you could go back just to one slide. So if you just heard about a slew of risks from Eric, and then from Janeen, you heard about how the GASB expects to respond to those risks and uncertainties. So let's talk about the audit side, because we as auditors have to be able to respond to those new risks as well. I'm sure most of you here are not auditors, but it's also good to know from our perspective as your entity is going to get audited. So like you, we've got evolving risks when performing our audits. We have to consider the new risks that your governmental agencies are facing. And along with that, there's new updated risk assessment requirements that are put out by the Auditing Standards Board. So they've been just as busy as the GASB, putting out forth new pronouncements or new standards that we have to abide by. And there's a whole new suite of standards that aren't going to affect just the risk assessment process, but also our procedures. It also affects audit evidence and even what a report looks like. So I'm going to give you an overview of what the standards are doing, but I'm going to focus most of my attention on SAS 145, and because we thought it's a good idea to have that kind of perspective. So you know that we aren't being as overly zealous in our audits as some people perceive us to be. So just kind of overall, just kind of a benchmark, so you know that the Audit Standards Board, they've been really striving to merge audit standards, the US audit standards, with international standards. So they actually use international standards as kind of a starting point. And it's more of a principles-based auditing standards versus a rules-based. So, you know, these are all conceptual that we have to follow, but they're not going to tell us exactly what to do. So I'm sure you all remember the COSO cube. So go ahead and thank you. So it's got the 5 primary components of controls. It's got the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and then monitoring activities. And then it also talks about the different areas, such as operations, reporting, and compliance. So as auditors, particularly governmental auditors, we're more focused on those components associated with reporting and compliance. When we talk about the audit standards changing on risk assessment, we aren't necessarily talking about that second band on that cube. We're talking about an overall valuation of the design and implementation of all parts of the cube. So you as an entity have your own risk assessment, but us as auditors have to do a risk assessment over all of this. So the new audit standards say it's very similar to the uniform guidance, where they said you don't have to follow necessarily COSO, but you need to follow some kind of framework, whether that's COSO or Green Book or some other kind of standard framework using other terminology. You don't have to you have to follow some kind of framework, but not specifically COSO. However, the audit standards do require us to address these 5 different areas, these 5 different components, when we're putting forth our audit documentation. So one thing that we do, or one thing to note while we're doing that, is the standard has allowed us to adjust things on a scalability component. They introduced a scalability component. And what that means is we get to consider the size of your organization as well as the complexity of it. So there could be some organizations that are fairly large, but has a fairly simplistic structure because everything is centralized and it really works for them, and they're able to get more efficiencies out of that. And you could also have the opposite. You could have a very small organization that's fairly complex for whatever reason. Maybe they're running a whole bunch of different programs. There needs to be more flexibility and autonomy in the different departments. It could be an aspect of monitoring compliance or other regulatory items. So the standards give us the flexibility to be able to not use a cookie cutter approach, but to address it the way we think are going to mitigate the risks. So some of the things that we're going to do that's going to impact you. As I mentioned, we're going to take a look at the components of the COSO cube as a whole. We're going to start evaluating your controls in relation to that. We'll look at the different principles and ask a whole bunch of questions. You know, we use the same kind of concept as journalists, asking who, what, when, where, why, how, in relation to your internal controls. We're going to evaluate your controls in light of the 17 principles that make up the different components. So we want to make sure that they're different, that they're appropriate at each of the different levels. A key area, and in line with this presentation, you know, with these new emerging risks and everything going on, you know, we do hope that you have an updated risk assessment over financial reporting as well as compliance. We'll look at your item, we'll look at that risk assessment, and we'll ask questions such as, what is your process for identifying risks, and did you identify any? Did you include the potential for fraud in any of those risks? Did you evaluate the significance of those risks? What about the likelihood? And then did you address any of those risks? So it's great if you identify them, you know, kudos, but you have to do something about them. An awareness in of itself is not necessarily addressing those risks. We'll also ask, when did you last update your risk assessment? You know, a number of entities, when the COSO cube came out back in 2013, or the newest iteration of the COSO cube came out back in 2013, they may have updated their risk assessment then, but did you update it for the pandemic? You know, there's a number of items that came out as a result of the pandemic, whether it's reduced revenue streams, or, you know, we saw at the very beginning, there was a number of cybersecurity attacks because people didn't have the security or infrastructure to protect their environment from when people were working from home. So we'll ask questions like that. What we're looking for is the identification of those risks and then the response to those risks. And then we're also making an evaluation of whether that process, all these processes really are appropriate. And if you identify the same risk that we did, if you didn't, why not? There could be something inherently wrong, or something just missing from your risk assessment process. So on the next slide, we've got the different components of the controls, or I'm sorry, the different principles related to the components of internal controls. So as I mentioned, there's also the Green Book that's put out the Government Accountability Office. They use similar principles, but you know, they try to one up COSO by adding more words to each of the principles. So it reads definitely, it's a lot more in depth, it seems like. So one difference though that I really appreciated within the Green Book is it includes, within that control environment framework, it includes an evaluation, like a performance evaluation of those people who are responsible for the internal control. So it's performance evaluation in the context of internal control. So that's the best way to exercise oversight responsibilities and enforcing accountability. I know most people are evaluated by their performance in relation to their job duties. They're evaluated by productivity, or, you know, I know not in government, but maybe in sales, but, you know, there could be other different metrics that we use. But how do you measure that in internal control responsibilities, you know, are the controls operating effectively for that particular person? So overall, these principles haven't changed since 2013. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the risk assessment aspect, since this is pretty much the theme of that presentation, are associated with risks. So the risk assessment, when you're performing that we would hope to see, would specify suitable objectives. These objectives would be specific, they would be measurable. So, I mean, we're all accountants, right? So we're obsessed with measurability for the most part. So why not include those metrics in your risk assessment? How do you benchmark that performance evaluation in relation to the internal controls addressing risk, or addressing that objective of mitigating risk? This should also include like a risk tolerance with an acceptable level of variation of performance. Should also include your responses. Again, it's great if you identify your risks. It's great if you point out the personnel responsible for addressing those risks, but what is actually the response to that risk? So in the next slide, we're going to move into the meat of SAS 145. So this is understanding the entity, its environment, and assessing the risk of material misstatement. So this is a very significant change in the risk assessment process for us. But really what this is doing, kind of the overarching principle, is to bring us as auditors from the Stone Age to the present. There's, with the pandemic, we saw a lot of changes in technology. We saw a lot of upgrades. People moved from computer towers to laptops a lot. So this is the Account Auditing Standards Board addressing those changes in technologies. So the bulk of the standard enhances our requirement and guidance related to our risk assessment in particular. We need to obtain an understanding of the agency's system of internal control and assessing control risk. It's revised requirements to evaluate the design of controls, but that also includes general IT controls, and to determine if they've been implemented. And as with all audit standards, there's a revised requirement related to audit documentation. So I think just about in every one I've seen an update to audit documentation. There's new requirements to separately assess inherent risk and control risk. So in the past, this wasn't required, although it was pretty much standard practice to get that done. So this essentially codifies that practice, is to assess them separately. It also says that if we're not testing in the effectiveness of controls, our assessment of the risk of material misstatement would be the same as inherent risk. So for example, if we are addressing an inherent risk as, a moderate risk, then our risk of material misstatement, and inherent risk, keep in mind, is without the context of controls, right? So essentially our risk of material misstatement would default to moderate, because inherently that's what the risk is. If you were to apply controls in there, you're just lowering the control of the risk at that point. And then again, as I mentioned previously, one of the main highlights was that it provides guidance on scalability. So how are we going to apply these new requirements to small organizations that are complex, large organizations that are simple, or some combination thereof? So as I noted earlier, on the next slide, we're required to obtain an understanding of controls in relation to the components and principles outlined in the COSO cube. Overall, there's two sets of controls that you would have. You would have indirect controls and direct controls. And so what are really indirect controls? It's basically the controls that are saying you can do it. It's telling the other controls that they can get the thing done. It states that the Statement on Auditing Standards has a technical definition that says they are not sufficiently precise to prevent or detect and correct material misstatements. And what that means is basically, if you take, for example, control of tone at the top, or an ethical policy, that's setting the guidelines or the framework for the internal controls to address those, but they're not actively contributing to reducing that likelihood of misstatement. But they are supporting that kind of environment. So these are the controls that are really foundational, and they have an indirect effect on the likelihood of a misstatement, but there's not a direct correlation. And then direct controls address the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. For the indirect controls, so they're kind of adjusting and tweaking, revising the standards a little bit about what we're supposed to do over these controls. For indirect controls, now we just need to gain an understanding of the control. We need to evaluate them, but we are not required to test the design and implementation of those controls. So imagine trying to test the design and implementation of tone at the top. It doesn't really lend itself to being tested. So we need to get an understanding of what that means, but we don't have to test that design. Indirect controls, when you think about it, it primarily impacts those three areas that are identified on this table. So control environment, risk assessment process, and monitoring. It also impacts information systems and communication. So in this chart, you can see what we're doing at kind of a higher level. But again, it's helpful to understand why we're doing what we're doing is because we're trying to assess the components of internal control. So for control environment, the purpose of this is to evaluate the consistency of behaviors in relation to your commitment of integrity and ethical values. And this is really the foundation of all the principles, of the other principles. For the risk assessment process, I've already touched on that we're obtaining an understanding of the risks. We're obtaining an understanding of your process and how you're responding to those risks. So we can actually use that as part of our audit documentation to start addressing some of those risks ourselves. For monitoring, we're getting an idea of what your direct controls are and how effectively they're operating. So in an ideal world, you would have a listing of control points for each process, and you would have an evaluation of whether they're operating effectively, if there have been any exceptions throughout the year, what those exceptions are. So that's part of the monitoring aspect. For information and communication, we're looking at the controls over your IT environment, which is a big thing in the standard. Developing those controls related to not just what are your controls over the applications, but what are your controls over the whole IT infrastructure that your entity has. Moving into direct controls, these are your review and approval by John Doe kind of controls that should be pretty well documented, whether it's through, if you're using paper copy, through a signature or initials, or if you're using workflow. Again, that's where the IT controls come in. That you would see that through a sign off by somebody's username. There are also controls related to the information system, which are called transaction controls or system controls. And these controls, the direct controls, the system controls, as well as the, your activity controls, they're going to have the most impact to how we go about your audit. So, for example, if you've got risk for which substantive procedures alone cannot be completed, such as automatic transactions, then we're required to perform a test of operating effectiveness on these controls. The standard provides an example, although it is a little bit dated, but for those of you in the know, back in the day, we used to have to pay additional charges on long distance phone calls. So long distance was typically the next county over, or it could be as little as the next city over. But how do you really evidence those controls or evidence that kind of revenue generation? What are some of the substantive procedures that can validate that account balance? There really aren't any. So we would test the operating effectiveness of controls to make sure that the input is correct, the throughput goes through appropriately, and the output is correct. Another example that I have that's probably a bit more relevant are toll roads. So how do you evidence cars going through toll roads? So in California, we have little boxes called fast tracks that when you pass under a sensor would ding and you would get charged. So how do you evidence that? You really can't. So you would evidence that control, or you would test that control, the operating effectiveness of that control, in order to get comfort over those account balances. The standard also defines a couple phrases. One of them is risks arising from the use of IT, as I previously talked about. And the other one was general IT controls. So we have to identify general IT controls that are related directly to risks arising from use of IT. So in the past, we've always talked about getting controls over your applications, who can authorize users, who develops permissions for your different softwares. Well, what about those controls that are related to change management? Those controls that, how does an application get updated? Who handles, what are the controls related to your firewalls? Who handles any phishing schemes? Or any attacks on the network infrastructures. So now we're required to identify controls related to that. And like I said, this does get us to an understanding of both IT applications as well as that infrastructure. And it's really important for us to know those people that are involved in that process now. All right, so I'm going to switch gears for just a minute, talk about some other standards that are coming into play or may have come into play, and then we'll go back until we'll go back to finish SAS 145. So I mentioned audit standards. They've been just as busy as the GASB over several years. There's a whole new suite of standards that start off with SAS 134 and go through 140 that were supposed to be implemented for periods ending on or after December 31st, 2020. But due to the pandemic, the AICPA, or the Accounting Standards Board, did something, Accounting Standards Board, oh my gosh, Auditing Standards Board did something unheard of and actually gave us a choice, us as auditors a choice. So we could go ahead and implement the standards and change our reports for that fiscal year ending on or after December 31st, 2020, or we could put into play for periods ending on or after 2021. So now that we're beyond 2021, there's no choice. Everybody's going to be implementing these new standards, 134 through 40 at the bare minimum. The biggest impact you're going to see, or depending on your perspective, you may have seen already, is that the auditor's report is going to change. So based on user feedback, the opinion is now the first section in the auditor's report. And then we actually talk about a basis of opinion. So if you remember in the past, the only time that we would have basis of opinion was when we have a qualified or adverse opinion. And we would talk about why that was qualified or adverse. Now we have a basis of opinion for unmodified opinions. And so they felt that it was really important to discuss like why it's an unmodified opinion, not just because we didn't find anything, but what's the actual audit evidence that we've obtained. Then the audit report goes into management responsibilities of management for the financial statements, and it's a little bit larger. They've added another paragraph to that report, or that section of the report, and then we go into auditor's report responsibilities for the audit. And this section's really been expanded. This includes areas, they've also added items such as key audit matters, which you may not see in the governmental realm, but you may see if maybe you handle for-profit or not-for-profit subrecipients, if you look at their financial statements. So keep in mind that this audit report is going to change, or may have already changed for some of your entities. It also breaks it up into different sections. Before we had one section for supplementary and other information is just kind of congealed together. Now they've actually separated it out and provide them each their own headers. So the audit reports changed significantly. The other standards are basic tweaks or adjustments to the other standards. So we have clarifications on engagement letters and communication letters. We have responsibilities relating to other information, including annual reports, more clarifications, and then changes to pension and OPEB reports and single audit reports. That they're basic minor adjustments that that you may see through the auditor's report. So there's still 3 more standards that have to be implemented with this suite. They're on the next slide. So the first one is, we've got SAS 142 through 144. So 142 for audit evidence, this actually brings up, so it updates sufficient appropriate audit evidence, but what it really talks about is us documenting different biases and how we're addressing our different biases, unconscious biases. So they go through a few examples, such as availability bias. Auditors are really prone to favor evidence that is available. Lack of evidence tends to kind of go by the wayside, but that lack of evidence could be, a telltale sign that we have to consider in of itself. Automation bias is another one. So we tend to favor transactions that have flowed through an IT system automatically versus information that has flowed through due to manual input. So we have to design and perform procedures that is in a manner that's not biased towards obtaining that kind of audit evidence. It also talks about how accounting records alone are no longer sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. you have to obtain information from other sources as well. So SAS 143 discusses obtaining audit evidence relating to accounting estimates and their disclosures. This is where the concept of separate assessments for inherent risk and control risk at the assertion level was introduced. And then SAS 144, it just kind of amends other items such as use of specialists, audit evidence. It's identified a couple practice issues. Kind of the big one that would impact the governments are, audit documentation related to management specialists, and then using pricing information on investments that's obtained from external sources. So 143 and 144 will be basically put into play next year along with 145, but these are important things to keep in mind, as you may get a lot more requests for documentation and inquiries as these start to get implemented. So finishing with SAS 145, just some other concepts. There are, one of the things that SAS 145 does is it develops a concept of what we call the spectrum of inherent risk. So as I mentioned earlier, we're now required to assess inherent risk and control risk separately. But inherent risk is now addressed on a spectrum from low to high. So that could mean low, moderate, maximum. That could be a number scale. Like I said, this is more of a concept-based statement or principles-based statement versus a procedures-based statement. But it's essentially saying, the statement is essentially saying inherent risk is developed by asking ourselves as auditors two questions without the consideration of controls. One, what is the magnitude of the potential risk? And two, what is the likelihood of the risk? And this is all done on the assertion level. So I envision, when I was thinking this concept through, I was actually envisioning the supply and demand graph that we had in Econ 101. And wherever those two lines intersect, if one you would consider magnitude of the potential risk, and the other one is the likelihood of the risk, wherever those two lines intersect, that's your level of inherent risk. So if it happened to be higher on the intersection of the graph, then it's clearly riskier. One example was maybe somebody taking $10 from a cashier till would be much more likely than someone pilfering $1 million from the bank. However, the magnitude of taking $10 is not very material unless you expect, that agency to be a sieve and leak all over the place. But the $1 million from the entity may not happen very often, but it could be much more significant. So those intersection points are going to be different. So you just want to take those into consideration. It revises the definition of what's called a relevant assertion. A relevant assertion is really now any assertion that's got an identified risk of material misstatement that is both reasonably possible, which is more than remote, if we go back into those scales that Janeen was talking about earlier, and possibly material. So these are, again, all within the context, without the context of controls. The next one, the next item that it does, it revises the term significant risk. So before, the significant risk was more focused on a response. So, changing special audit procedures, I believe, was the phrasing that it used to use. So now significant risk is going to focus on items that have a risk on the upper end of the inherent risk spectrum, as I just talked about. So this is based on, those degrees that I was telling you about, the likelihood and the magnitude of the potential misstatement. And then you all know we have to remain professionally skeptical as auditors. So the AICPA or ASB has enhanced guidance by requiring us to highlight the benefits during our engagement team discussion that happens before and during the audit. So the benefits of remaining professional skeptical and allowing for the possibility of contradictory evidence to be obtained and maintained. And we can use that information to prove that we have the appropriate level of skepticism. We also need to have that appropriate level of understanding of the entity and its environment, and in this case of GASB, to remain professionally skeptical. So it emphasized that point, that we have to have that appropriate level of understanding. There's also a stand back rule, and that's being implemented. And this is like a stand back and look at the whole picture. So I talked about relevant assertions just a minute ago. There may be items that don't have a relevant assertion because they're not risky. There's the likelihood is remote, the magnitude is minimal, but as a whole, when we're looking at the whole audit, there could be some assertions that have that would impact us. So this really forces us to look at the audit globally instead of section by section. It really refines our risk assessment process. And then, like I said, there's audit documentation requirements, additional audit documentation. So the valuation of design of identified controls and whether or not they've been implemented. And then our rationale for any significant judgments made regarding the identified risks of material misstatement. And that's pretty much it for the risk assessment. Like I said, some big changes that came through. And at that point, I think I'm going to open it up for any questions that you guys may have.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Janeen, and great job today. We do have some questions in the chat. Let's see. What do you think about investing in crypto? Elaborate a little more. Don't even get me going on this. Okay, you don't want to get me going. First of all, let me just say that I am not an investment advisor. I am not providing investment advice and so on. I am an individual investor, and actually one that is accredited. And I am going to put on my hat that I wore for much of the 1990s when I was a chief financial officer of a very large state organization with tens of millions of dollars to invest every single day. I used to have a line of folks line up outside my office or on the phone long about, maybe about 2:30, 3 o'clock every afternoon saying, have I got a deal for you? And whenever somebody says, have I got a deal for you, and gives you, quote unquote, guaranteed profits, with quote unquote minimal risk, chances are there is no guarantee on the profits, and chances are there is high risk. And what I would tend to do is, for advice, if I were to look for a place for advice, the largest investment house in, I believe, actually in the world, is Fidelity. And Fidelity has a great guide on the risks of investing in Bitcoin. And there are numerous risks that they point out. And basically, here, I'll read you the first sentence because this came in about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I pulled it up on my screen. It says, some speculators have been drawn to Bitcoin trading as a way to make a quick profit. Now, just in those 8 or 9 words, if you're a government and you're thinking about this, remember those words. The word speculator is in there, and quick profit phrase is in there. So consider that if you're a government financial manager, you're considering to invest. It's really up to your risk tolerance, but chances are it's a risky bet. Cybercrime is actually, before I go further, James, Janeen, do you have any thoughts? Again, use your own personal opinions on that, because again, none of us are investment providers.
I have no additional thoughts. It's a kind of a black box, right?
Yeah, it is. It is.
I don't have anything additional, Eric. Half the time I'm like, what is crypto? I think I need to get with the program.
I get a little nervous when Elon Musk puts his dog on the face of a cryptocurrency and says, yeah, we're going to make a currency called Dogecoin, which is really Dogcoin or whatever. And it actually trades. And I get a little nervous about that one, but maybe I'm just too conservative of an investor. Maybe it's my age. But yeah, there's definitely risk. So here's another one. Cybercrime is perceived as white collar crime. Doesn't this explain the lack of focus on the topic? If there is no blood, it almost seems victimless. That's a good thought. You know something? Thinking about what you wrote there, which is really astute. Thinking about what you wrote there. Sometimes crime, at least in my own personal opinion, a lot of folks don't focus on that until it happens to them. And I want you to think about that, the next time you open your phone, just during this presentation, over the last almost 2 hours, I got 2 phone calls from numbers I didn't know of. And if you play the message that they left, it was in a different language. And so the question is that a victimless crime or not? Yeah, sure. It crimps my style in the fact that I have to listen to this message, or I have to look at my phone and say, gee, who is calling me from insert the name of the place? It usually says the United States on it. Okay, great. But that means that somebody else's phone number was hacked to call mine. And I'm sure you deal with this stuff every day on your cell phone. So is it a victimless crime? I would say we're all victims of it. And I kind of disagree. I think we're all victims of cybercrime in one way, shape, or form. And if we're not, chances are it's going to happen at some point. And maybe what we should do, we should finish off with this one. This was in Monday's edition of the New Yorker. Now, I don't read the New Yorker. I'm not 100% in agreement with it, but their cartoons are fantastic. And maybe this is how we all feel. And I don't really feel like playing Risk after all. And this was in this Monday's edition, so it was perfectly appropriate. So with that, anything else in the chat for Q&As?
No, we are good.
All right, we pretty much stuck the landing. So with that, I really want to thank everybody today. Coming next week, we're going to be, again, talking to you on the American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So please feel free to join us next week. You will see some information from Amy right after I stop talking. But first, I wanted to thank James and Janeen for joining me today, and did a great job. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Amy. And Amy, thank you as always.
Thank you so much for attending. Thank you to our awesome presenters today. And we will talk to everyone next time. Have a good one, guys.